What generation?
That is, the question of the end times is, and our view of it, always a couple of principles. I don't have any slides for this portion, but that's fine. It's just one thing I want to draw on the board that I want you to at least think about. One's view of the end times is one of those is another one of those rare doctrines where evangelicals just go, look, I get it, but totally disagree and totally read that differently, but you love Jesus, that's fine. Like, again, you might have profound differences with one side or the other because you don't think they're taking into account these verses or this structure enough. That's fine. But for whatever reason, at least in American Christianity, there is a tendency sometimes to fight more about the things we admit the other side can still be a Christian and hold. Whereas we wink at some of the goofy stuff people say that has historically never been said or whatever that might be. The question though with the end times, if you were to get one of those like 19 views on the end times books, or I guess there's only like 4 views, but still, or 2 views in the rapture, or 3 views in the rapture, all that type of stuff. My experience as a young student, as a young believer, was no one made any sense in those books because it all sounded like there was 19 variations and everyone was citing the Bible, and I couldn't figure out what's the difference between all these. And I think it is factually wrong to say that there are 4 or 5 different views. When it comes down to the end times, there's only 2 distinctions. There's only 2. In other words, there's halves. The question turns on one thing. This is all that turns on. This is the whole shooting match, as they used to say. Does anything happen between the second coming and the final judgment? This is all that divides. So, on the one hand, you have those who say, no, nothing happens between the 2. Which means they see that the story of or the prophecies, the language, the apocalyptic language in Revelation is describing an ongoing state that will happen until the end. And they also, when Paul says that we will be caught up into the heavens, that language is of the end. So there are folks who legitimately, they're reading the scriptures just like you, and if you disagree with this, and they're saying, when Jesus comes back, that's it. That'll be the end. This is sorry, there's a little bit of feedback here, but these are the folks that are a lot of different names. Millennialism, and a group called post-millennialism. Now, the distinction between these is virtually not all that much. They are actually both the same. The difference is these guys here, the second one, have a different view of the very end and what happens. Post-mill folks believe at the very end there's a dramatic increase of God's people throughout. Like, we go from persecuted minority to lots of converts, and but they both say specifically that when you see Jesus on the clouds, that's it. There's nothing in between. There's no millennium, there's no 7 years, there's no rapture, there's no pre-trib, post, all those pieces are not there. It's when he comes, that's it. And they get there because, again, in Thessalonians, when Paul's talking about called up into the heavens, they note that immediately Paul says, and then they're talking about the judgments that come and the way that that's it. There's no peace in between. On this side, could they say yes, of course, that there is something between the second coming and the final judgment. Within that, there's a lot of variety. There's what we call historic, I should write it in black to be consistent. There's what we call historic, premill, dispensational, premill, etc. Anytime you see people with end times charts and they're trying to locate when the rapture happens versus other things, what you're seeing in those charts and in those descriptions are people describing what's happening between. And that's why there's a lot of debate, and they're not all on the same page on that. And sometimes folks on this side will fight with each other as much as they'll fight with the people on this side. And so I'm not saying that just because you could fit under one category means that you're all just basically the same. There's lots of variety here. The main difference that I think you have to wrestle with, and you may still in the end say, I can't quite say for certain yet, but what you need to look at, is the question of when you see those passages in the Bible that describe Jesus coming, or the end, the judgment, the second coming. Do you believe the New Testament is bearing witness that there is then something else that happens before the judgment, or do you believe that the picture that you're seeing is relatively one moment? Jesus comes, then the final judgment. That's the difference. So the and Amil is not that they don't believe in the end times or that Jesus is coming back. The being a negative means they don't believe there's something in between. The fact that these are called pre-mill, the pre just means that we're living before the thing between the two testaments. But the pre-post, at some point you just your head spins a little bit. But the distinction has always been historically, some believe that Jesus comes back and there's something that happens. Others believe that when he comes back, that's it. That is the new heavens and new earth occurring at that moment. That he's going to bring judgment and these types of things. Now, let's walk through a couple of I think that one of the main debate points that people overlook, and this might be a place where you look at it, is the question of the strong man. The binding of Satan, as it's called, right? So in this side, those who believe that there is no distinction between when Jesus comes back and the eventual final judgment, they point out that in the book of Revelation, that when Satan is thrown into a lake of fire and there's a locking up of his ability, that the fact that it's John writing the book of Revelation should tell us that if there's anything in the Gospel of John that is talking about binding up and the throwing out of Satan, that might actually tell us what's happening in Revelation. And if you go and look in the Gospel of John, actually right before the cross, Jesus says, as it say, now I go to throw Satan from this world. And the language of now that in Revelation that Satan is bound up and can no longer deceive who? The nations. Would indicate that there might be a partnership between those two themes. That what Christ does in binding the strong man, and by the way, in the other synoptic gospels, Jesus talks about you plunder his house after you tie him up. That what the left side here says is, that's an indication that when you're looking at Revelation, the language of the throwing of Satan into the lake of fire, the binding up, the locking of him away so that he can no longer deceive the nations, is actually the cross and the work that Christ is doing there. That's so they say. And then what they would say is, therefore, the rest of it that we're reading after it is to be read in symbolic language, not merely figurative language as if it doesn't matter, but symbolically. And therefore, when you see for 1,000 years, it doesn't have to be a literal 1,000 years to still be true. So, in other words, these folks are taking the Bible perfectly seriously, just like anybody else. But what they say is, the language that John's revelation shows seems to indicate, they say, that a lot of what's going on there is the cross and the victory Christ wins. Therefore, the ongoing stuff of the beast, well, that's Rome. And the language in Rome is always identified as the beast in at least the first 2 or 3 centuries. Now, that might hold water. You might say that sounds very like a good possible way of reading that scripture. You have to know, though, that even in the early church, all the way from the beginning, there were people that were on the historic side as well. That they read Revelation a little bit more as a timeline of everything to come, rather than a timeline, some that has occurred and some that will happen at the end, if that makes sense. So while again, as long as you understand that these guys are not just like anti-future, anti-Jesus coming back, that's not their position. I remember when I was in college, I spent a summer at a friend's house. They were from a church that was dispensational, it's fine. And I remember sitting there and I said, I'm going to go to seminary, and they said, oh, what's your seminary? I didn't even know where I was going at. They said, what seminary are you going to go to? What's their position on the end times? And I said, I don't know. I said, I don't know. I just had no category. And they started to talk about people that they had heard were on-mill and post-mill, and they said they don't really care about their Bibles. They don't read them at all. It's like, I don't think that's true either. I think they do probably read them. The question is, how are they reading those verses that are clearly meant to be read symbolically over against others? Now, and that's one last little thing I'll get before I go here. You don't, I say this a lot, but I want to really stress it. It is not true that one side reads the Bible literally and the other doesn't. No one reads the book of Revelation literally, right? No one believes in a literal beast coming out of a literal, I think someone said there was once somebody that did this. But anyway, we don't believe in a literal beast and a literal sea coming out with, that Jesus has a literal sword coming out of his face. All of this is read symbolically, apocalyptically. So the high ground isn't gained because you say you read the Bible literally. The point is how are you reading it, right? And so these folks read it and they say, you know what, Revelation seems to be an indication as to what's happening in the 1st century, not what's happening in the 21st century. So the binding of the strong man mentioned in the Gospels is the binding of Satan in Revelation. So they're inclined to say that Revelation is indicating the full extent of what we're going through now until he comes back. But when he comes back, they say that's it. That's their position. Goodness sake. This side, though, obviously sees a difference. And I actually spent some time the last week listening to lectures of people that are historic pre-mill and some others. One of the more interesting arguments that one person made talking about this is he just said, look, I understand that the Gospels say that Jesus bound up Satan, plundered his house, and all this type of stuff. He said, however, the enactment of what the beast is doing and the language of binding up Satan and these things in the account of Revelation seems to be a more severe account of a final binding, if that makes sense. He said it's one thing to say Satan is bound and Satan was overthrown at the cross, but of course there's still evil in this world and it's not fully gotten rid of. Therefore, what he says in Revelation is a final overthrowing out of Satan so that he can no longer even do anything anymore. And so the argument on this side is that when they look at the book of Revelation, it is indicating, all of it is indicating what is going to happen in the future. It's all pointing ahead, just about. Maybe not every word, but it's all pointing ahead. Now, again, I want you to always wear both sides. What would be an argument against that, besides the one I already gave you? It's very clear right at the beginning that if somebody wanted to attack that point, what's happening in the first couple of chapters that would indicate that this is not about the future? They actually mentioned 7 historic churches that are supposed to take this into account now. That's what these guys will point out back to them is, Well, if it's for the future, why wouldn't he say, hey, why is it mentioned 7 churches right now with proclamations about one being lukewarm and all this type of stuff? And the response is, from this side, it's like they've read that too. They're aware that that's there. And what they end up, the typical response is one of two. They'll say either it begins with a proclamation to those who are going to receive it, after which the prophecy is for the future after having chastised them for their current actions and warned them of the future. Does that make sense? So the seven churches in Revelation are warned, and then the prophecy picks up about how they ought to look ahead to what's to come. That kind of stuff. And they go back and forth. So this is really where it turns. And I'm not asking, and again, no less than Luther and Calvin and lots of other reformers don't actually comment on this. It's one of the most frustrating parts of the Reformation. Is virtually no one talks about the book of Revelation. It's not because they don't believe it, it's because they are aware of the historical reality that there are a lot of opinions about this. And what I would encourage you to do is to know yours in general, particularly on this question. Go to Thessalonians and say, do I see this as something that's occurring between, something that's happening between, or do I see that as the end? And again, you may not have a dogmatic conclusion on that, but I would expect you to at least have worn that through. But I mean, Protestant confessions don't give you an end times eschatology. Again, you're not going to go open Luther on Revelation 4 and read his opinion of the mark of the beast. The church has remained relatively mum about this as a dogmatic conclusion, even within whatever tradition you're in. The only exception is in the last 125, 150 years, with the rise of some folks' dispensational churches, it has become more of a dividing mark in general. There's been more fights. People are more prone to get upset, like the family I lived with that one summer, because the other side has a difference of opinion. I don't think that's historic Christianity. I think historic Christianity is to say, look, how are you interpreting the Bible? Okay, we can talk about that. We can debate that. But suffice to say, as long as you hope Jesus is coming back, you're on solid ground here, all right? In that way. But you have to get some of the analysis down on this question, at least for your papers. Do I think there's a space between the two? Or do I think it's one and the same? Jesus comes back, and that's it. All right. Any questions on that? That's where I'll stop. Yeah.
What was the difference between the two flavors of pre-mill?
Yeah, the two flavors. Historic pre-mill goes back to as early as the 2nd century, is some of the early comments. It just says that this and between is filled with either a 1,000-year reign or something. They believe there's something there. Dispensational pre-mill is a different animal in general because of its understanding of Israel. So dispensational churches, this comes out of Schofield and stuff in the 1800s, believes that obviously you have the nation of Israel and its promises, and then when Jesus comes, Israel rejects it. So what Jesus does is he puts them in a timeout, so to speak, and it becomes the church age. After which, whenever that comes to an end, you have a restoration of the nation of Israel. And they rebuild the temple, they start doing the sacrifices again, all that stuff. And then as a result of that, all of the book of Revelation stuff kicks in. This is why, by the way, the people that are prone to date the return of Christ, date it with the refounding of the nation of Israel in 1948. That's why 88 reasons why Jesus comes back in 1988 was how Lindsay said, one generation after the formation of Israel, you need to have it. A generation is 40 years, 48, 88, boom. That didn't happen, so we came up with 89 reasons why it's 1989. That's one of my favorite 1-2 book punches. But anyway, the logic here is that the church age, we're under a different, hence the name, dispensation. Now, there are lots of varieties of this. Those of you in dispensational churches can tell me more or less. The main points of anxiety are, how do we feel about the nation of Israel right now, meaning the country? Even though we understand that it itself might be a relatively secularized world, how are we approaching Israel? And then how do we take the prophecies of the Old Testament? Because in most dispensational categories, it leapfrogs. So the prophecies of Israel were suspended until the end, and then they come back again. That makes sense. And so we're basically under a different category, different dispensation, that type of thing. The idea is that because God said all of Israel will come back, the notion that so few Jewish people seem to believe in the first century is evidence that it gets punted. All those prophecies have to happen so they get punted to the end. Am I hitting it close?
Yeah.
You're the one, there's more. Has that been here? The experience I have, personally, in dispensational folks and those in dispensational churches, the question that comes up a lot I hear is, what about the nation of Israel? It's a strong concern for Israel itself, correct?
Yeah, because of their claim of the hermeneutic of
Literalism.
they really struggle to flex on any of the literal fulfillment of any prophecy in the text. So it's easier, rather than saying, hey, maybe the church has even what's his name, Bruce Waltke would say that if God, if somebody promised you $1, and then when they go to pay up on it, he actually puts $1 million in the bank account, because he's just so overwhelmed. Did it? You turn and look at him and say, yeah, but you said you're going to give me $1.
Where's the dollar, fool?
Yeah, where's the dollar? And so you've got some of that going on. We have the cross, we have Christ, we have the church, we have everything.
The Gentiles grafted in, and then
the whole 9 yards. It's
we're sitting here in Jacksonville after 2,000 years later.
Right, 2,000 years that Christ has spread across, and then the dispensation looks at the text and says, yeah, but God promised Abraham this land. This specific land in this specific place. And because I'm not comfortable with turning scripture allegorical to make all of this the fulfillment of that, I need to know. It's easier for me to say, well, he's going to do that later. Yeah. So that's.
Well, and one of the things is historic pre-mill, and these guys over here do believe the land of Israel and all of the globe is restored. And that's what Revelation 21 is. Heavenly Jerusalem comes down. It's not, Christ will reign there.
New Jerusalem.
New Jerusalem, that's right. One of the more stunning, let me put it this way. There are folks that are dispensational, like Dallas Seminary right now is what we call progressive dispensationalists, which is just a way of saying that they don't quite go with all of some of where this could go. For example, one of the books written on prophets, on the prophets of the Old Testament, by an Old Testament professor from Dallas Seminary, which has been historically the most dispensational, where most dispensational pastors come from. We use one of their professors' books at RTS, which is an Amil school. So, there's a lot different now. However, one of the most spooky passages or chapters I've ever read was at the beginning of a Chuck Colson book, where he talks about a president of the United States who buys into this, and he wants to nuke certain people in Israel, and he wants to nuke Islam out of the Holy Land so that they can rebuild a temple and start physical sacrifices again, because he wants to kick off the end. And you're going, well, why would he not do that? How do we not do that?
Well, it brings us to the surface. It's a submarine that gets popped to the surface because the implications become damning. The fact that in order to have the church age as this parenthesis, you cannot say that Christ is ruling on the throne right now.
He has to be waiting.
He has to be waiting. He is away waiting, and when he comes back is when he takes the throne and he's ruling. And so our church age is sort of this, like, we're without a king kind of thing, where Scripture seems to really...
But even calling it the parentheses, like
the parentheses,
that's not the bride of Christ, we're the parentheses kind of afterthought church.
Right, so your progressive dispensationalists are backing off of that language. They're saying,
Joseph, by the way, has churches of lots of old guard dispensationalists who yell at him a lot about this stuff, so that's why I'm looking at him.
Also, I was raised in this church since I was 4, so I'm like, my first paper to Ryan had more red ink on that paper, just helping me work through some of these things. But and so I'm very sympathetic to it, but some of the damages are pretty powerful.
Sure.
You're progressive. I appreciate, like Darrell Block, the work he's doing to progress this, because they're saying, no, we can't get around the exegesis that Christ is on the throne. We can't get around that, so we've got to think through our terminology and some of the things.
Is there any connection to where like dispensationalists believe in like kind of a more young earth, since it's more of a literal view of 1,000 years?
Absolutely.
But then amillennialism is more of like an old earth.
Yeah.
Well, all millennials going to say, I don't care.
Yeah. Although, I mean, an Amil person is aware that one can read, put it this way, other than, I think the folks who use the word literal the most are this style of dispensational. And those are the people I'm mainly saying, like, you're not reading it literally. It's not a literal beast. You're still saying allegorical or metaphorical. But yeah, in that sense, there are a lot of here I stand passages. It says caught up into the heavens. So you're saying there's no rapture? No, I'm saying you put rapture into that verse, and now you're telling me I have to go with that kind of piece. And it's more, I mean, the hermeneutic of the way you take Scripture seriously is you read it on its own terms. So if the Bible is meant to be poetic, you read it poetically. If it's meant to be metaphorical, or at least apocalyptically symbolic, you read it symbolically. If it's meant to be read literally, you read it literally. So the resurrection accounts of Christ are the nature of their narrative is meant to be pointing to the literal. Like, put your finger in my side, touch me. I will. The very physical nature of it. He's eating fish with them. It's pointing to we have seen him. So it's not suggesting metaphorical interpretation of resurrection. However, you can't read Revelation and think that it necessarily means an actual literal interpretation in the sense of physical beast, physical sea, all that stuff. It has to be symbolic. And you're right. I think the biggest problem with some of this old school stuff is it basically says Gentile church was an afterthought. It was an oopsie almost, because Israel said no and then it punted. This has pushed some folks, some recent folks, TV preachers. Hagee is one of them. Hagee just came out last couple of years and said, Jews don't need Jesus to be saved.
Right.
I mean, he says this explicitly. And everyone's like, why would he say that? This is why. We need Jesus in here because we're Gentiles, but the Jews don't need Jesus to be. And I'm going, the only way to salvation is Jesus is Lord. It couldn't be any clearer passages in Scripture than you need Jesus. Jew or Gentile, you need Jesus. You need to have faith in him. And what's happening is his desire to live up to this is wreaking havoc on other verses. It tends to, yeah.
The preterists, where did they fall on the left-hand side?
Yeah, there's a language called preterist, or preterist. You can say, I don't want to say, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Preterists are those who frankly don't fit any of the categories. They believe, it depends on how strongly they argue this, but a typical preterist argues that Revelation is only dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, this is my personal opinion. I think the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus is talking about when you see them coming, run. I think he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's not talking about the end, the full end. So why else would he tell the people sitting around him to run? And he's talking about the armies coming, marching toward this. It's clearly there will be not a stone left. That kind of language. I think that is not referring to the final judgment or anything. That's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem for rejecting Messiah, as Jesus says. However, full preterists think of all of Revelation in the same way. It's only referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, and what they end up doing is at their worst, they'll end up saying, this is the new heavens and new earth. Yay. I was like, really? What's that movie? This is as good as it gets. Yeah, this is the new heavens and new earth is already here. And they are completely over-realized, and they believe that it's all happened, the judgment came, and so it's not, so it's almost as if they don't expect a second coming. I'm not sure what they think happens if they die. But it's often, because, I mean, almost every denomination I know has basically said you can't hold that in that harsh of a term. You can believe that Revelation is perhaps referring in part to the destruction of Jerusalem, but you can't hold to it as an ism in almost every denomination that I know of.
Is an R.C. Sproul preterist?
Not, he's what they call partial. He kind of is.
He's partial a lot.
Yeah. And really what R.C. is, he's so tired of hearing this thrown at him a lot that he's kind of pushed it the other way.
I've always communicated preterism as sort of a pendulum swing from.
Yeah.
from
It is. It actually very much is. Yeah.
So what's the thought that both the preterist and the dispensational view are emerged from Jesuit theology encountering the Reformation as a way to kind of say, no, Rome's not Babylon, no,
Yeah.
and then it was just kind of picked up later in other circles.
Yeah, that's too much of a conspiracy theory. That's actually not the genealogy. It comes from Quakers. It comes from Quakers, candlestick makers, the whole joke. The 1800s, after the Great Awakening's revivals, there were a lot of apocalyptic movements that proclaimed that the end is nigh. I mean, that's where we almost get that symbol of the person wearing the big piece of wood that says the end is near. That's not a new thing. That's been happening for about 150 years. In the 1800s, people get really, really concerned about this. And one of the big predictions that he's coming back was in 1850. And it was all based on this type of stuff. They though, didn't date it according to Israel, they dated it according to Napoleon. So Napoleon was the Antichrist, so they dated it that way. And then there was this move, I'll talk about this a bit in church history. There was something called the Great Disappointment, where thousands of people were waiting out in the fields for him to come on the clouds, and he didn't. And so they spilled out of that. My favorite group that came out of it thought that Jesus was stuck in the clouds, and they had to pray really hard to get him out. That's when you're not giving up your theology, no matter what your eyes tell you. But what ends up happening is groups come out of that, and you have this fervor, you don't know what's in the bloodstream, but there's this sense of the end is about to happen. We can work it out. I mean, you start seeing these Bible charts of what's the clay feet versus all the different nations, and people starting to work out Daniel and what is the 70 times 7 weeks, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's not Jesuit stuff. It's more well-intentioned, untrained folks in revival contexts who feel like they have a premonition from the Lord that's leading them to a deeper insight into what this stuff means in Scripture. And what they then do is they start to publish it, and they start to comment on it, and it just becomes a thing that people do. And what I tend to say is, in that century, and I think ever since, so for the last 150 years, that is actually abnormal for church history. For most of church history, we allow for differences of opinion, but we're very cautious. We never allow people to start predicting when and how, and the chart stuff has never been throughout church history anything we've ever done until more recently. But now that it's in the bloodstream, this is something churches love to do. Now, I grew up in this world, so I could speak from experience. What I have found is that end times prophecies are not for their own sake, personally. I find that wherever you find a church that dramatically always is emphasizing the end times, they're doing it for evangelism. Because if you watch a sermon like on that to the end, and for the last 5 to 7 minutes, they'll say, listen, folks, we know the time is short, and we know that Christ is coming back, so let me offer you the gospel. And it's a bit of a doom and gloom, and pivot, here's Jesus, let me offer you that way. I don't think that's the typical way of offering the gospel. I think it's, you're a sinner, here's the mirror, you got problems, you need Jesus. I don't think fear of the world around us is what drives us to the cross, per se. So anyway, my experience was it was very often used as a way of telling us how to read the times, but also how to get energized to go share the gospel with our neighbors. And if we had brought folks in, that was the instinct. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say too, you was talking about the 1800s when they out to in the Thessalonians book, when they say caught up in the air.
Yeah.
For me, I'm looking at it like caught up in the spirit, not a dead body coming up out of
Yeah.
the ground, floating
Yeah.
up in the air, and people looking like that's what's gonna happen.
Sure.
But caught up in the spirit, because in the twinkling eye, you've already been changed to a glorified body.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I historically, at least the way most of the people that I've read in the past, a long time ago, they would have read that as, that's just the final resurrection. The resurrection of the dead and life everlasting, that's it. And in the 1800s is when it gets read as something that's happening before the end, yeah. Now, the big thing here is just keep your head on straight. While I'm asking you to answer one basic question is where do you fall, perhaps? I'm not asking you to work all this out in this single paper. There's a lot of exegesis here. There's a lot of judgment calls. I do think that the only thing I would caution is a church that majors on this, minors on everything else. And so that's the caution. I would minor hard on this in that way. At least not to the extent that you trust that Christ is coming, that he will make. I would much rather you preach on Revelation 21 than on some of the other chapters there, put it that way. Point them to that chapter and say, look, this is at least the teleos, this is the end, no matter where you fall on it. All right, any last questions?
Were the fault lines for these guys? Like, so are there certain denominations that fall more on millennial versus?
No, actually, believe it or not. Now, we're used to saying that, a dispensational folk are Baptist or Congregational, and the Mill, Post-Mill guys are Presbyterian Reformed. But if you look at the Evangelical Free, the EV Free folks, they are Calvinistic top to bottom, but they are pre-mill historic. So you'll find that on either side that there are, it's one of the rare doctrines that can be fit into any of the historic Protestant categories. The only one that doesn't fit that way is Calvinism or Reformed theology and dispensationalism. Because Calvinism stresses so much the unity of the covenant from the old to the new, the parenthetical age is that. But they're not the only one. Lutherans wouldn't embrace it either, and others don't embrace it from historic categories.
Catholicism?
Catholicism would not embrace it either.
What view they would?
They are Amel.
Okay.
There are some, though, that are, again, within the history of the Catholic Church, there are some that have been leaning more that kind of thing. They really don't talk about it, though.
Huh.
Yeah. They just want you to follow the Pope. The Pope. You follow the Pope?
So when someone talks about the Antichrist, what my impression is, maybe I'm wrong, is that it's the spirit of the Antichrist.
Right.
So it's like Nero could have been an Antichrist.
Yeah.
Hitler could have been an Antichrist.
That in particular, almost the entirety of the church has been very clear. The spirit of Antichrist means that it is a ongoing manifestation of. It could be from a political ruler, it could be from a spiritual leader, it could be from within the church, from without the church.
So it's not one specific.
Yeah. There are some who think both now. There are some who will say there will be the ultimate epitome of the spirit of Antichrist who almost seems to be that themselves. I mean, Martin Luther famously said the Pope is the Antichrist. The reason why is he's not just speaking hardcore there. He's like, this guy has taken over God's church, made himself king of the world, and told everyone to believe in salvation by works.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in his mind, he just thinks this is what the Antichrist does. Even the Anglican 42 articles said that the Pope is the Antichrist. It was actually one of their confessional standards for a long time.
Jonathan Edwards, too.
Yeah. And so it's this language of, what's very interesting, I'll leave you with this. In the modern world, we tend to think the Antichrist has to be a political entity. That's one of the things that clued me in that some of the language of the end times was going a bit too far. I just noticed that the Antichrist always seemed to be whoever America was maddest at the most. It was Russia, then it was Vietnam, and then it was out. Yeah, yeah. That might be true though. No, but it was always. But notice it was always whoever America was mad at, as if we're the chosen nation.
Or my dad.
Is that, or you?
I heard America, or my dad was mad at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could be personal and vendetta. That's actually the other words. But the other thing was that they're always political. So why wouldn't it be someone of, why wouldn't it be a very influential spiritual leader that, if it's going to be someone who deceives the church, it's probably not going to be ISIS.
Probably somebody the church would believe.
Yeah, it'd be somebody we're listening to, yeah. So in that sense, I think historically we're always more concerned about spiritual gurus than we are about the political rulers. Yeah.
On the more humorous side, if the Pope's the Antichrist, so does his antichristical authority carry on Pope?
It has to. If you believe he's the Antichrist, it's the handing on from touch the magic hands. That's right.
What about like the rapture? Like, which side? So that you're saying the right side is saying that's something that.
That the right side says the rapture is something that occurs, and then there's something. Now they debate what, but there's something that happens before the end. Maybe it's 1,000 years. Maybe it's the 7-year tribulation, then the 1,000, or the 1,000 plus the 7. I mean, they have the different way they line it up.
What does the left side say?
The rapture is the end. It
So
is the
it's all
calling. It is
happening
the resurrection.
Right now.
Yeah. Because of the binding of the strong. One example is, if Jesus bound the strong man up in the Gospels at the cross, then that binding in Revelation tells you that what's happening since is as a result of the cross. Therefore, it's not punted to the future.
It's not something. So the left side would say that's happening now. The right
Yeah.
side would say that's something that it's more like this is literally going to happen. Like,
Yeah, in exactly a certain way. Yeah.
Okay,
All right, folks.
Okay. Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you.